Danke, Carola Kraus. Danke Ihnen fürs Kommen. I will now switch to English because it's our language of choice for this talk. And Carola has already sketched out what the motivation for this talk is. I just want to say that what I found interesting about thinking about a panel for tonight is that you could say that pattern and decoration was born out of conversations between mostly artists, but also art critics and the public in the mid-70s in New York. And I thought it would be interesting to stage a panel where some of the artists who were present for these initiating conversations maybe revisit some of the ideas that brought them together in the first place. But as importantly, I would also like to think about what those ideas, which are now more than 40 years old, mean for today. And maybe scratch the surface of thinking about why pattern and decoration has something of a, I think you could call it a revival these days, since we're not the only ones who are working on exhibitions and on introducing or reintroducing audiences to your work. And what I thought is that I have a few key points that I can bring to the table, but I already noticed yesterday that all of you have a lot of things to talk about with each other as well. So I will always jump in when I think we require a new topic, but I'm also happy to hear questions that you might have for each other. And yes, I also want to say that unfortunately Kim MacConnel can't be here tonight. He would have been a wonderful addition to the panel. I think he caught the flu and cancelled his flight, or had to cancel his flight. So maybe to start a little bit, start with history a little bit. 1975, the very first meeting, some of you were present, I think, and if the books don't lie, that meeting took place at your New York loft, Robert. And maybe you just want to give an idea to our audience. What were the issues that were discussed in this first meeting, but also in successive ones, the ones that were open to the public? So I would be curious to hear a little bit about those issues. Yeah, don't get too distracted. This is just background noise.
This is not fair. They get to watch, but we can't.
I can send you the PowerPoint presentation afterwards.
But we should turn the face.
I'm the only lucky one with this chair.
So this is a question to all of you. What were the original?
What was the question?
I was thinking of these very first meetings. What brought you together? Why did you think about meeting up with other artists in the first place?
You know, that's a really interesting question.
Could you use the microphone, Robert?
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Well, I think about that a lot because this whole thing seemed to happen simultaneously without the East Coast and the West Coast knowing about it. It's very interesting. Because I started seeing art in New York City apart from what was being sold, the formalist painters, and then I started seeing different things about pattern, but not a lot of it, you know. And then I went out to the coast, and I talked with Miriam Schapiro, who was teaching out there, and then I talked with her and said, you know, there are things going on in New York, and I think we should have a meeting when we both get back to the coast. And that's how it really started, because I started seeing work in New York. I think Tony Robbins, I went to his studio and saw about 11 works that he did of these big 10-foot paintings that were done in rollplex. And he just rolled them out, basically, one after the other. It was so exciting because, you know, we were real formal, only formalism was selling, and it was minimalism and all of that. So anyway, something was really going on. And then I go out to the coast and I meet Kim MacConnell, and it's like the same sentiment was going on the East and West. And I don't know how that happened. It was just happening.
So what was happening? And that's to everyone, really.
You know,
first come, first serve.
You know, wait a minute. I'm going to read this because I wrote this today, and I'm not going to throw it away.
Don't want to save that
it's
for...
just one. It's going to be the same thing because we're all talking about the same thing. It's just coming at a different way.
I'm not so sure about that.
Well, we'll find out. But let's see. All right. This is Pattern and Decoration, the so-called movement that never was. Changed in the middle of the 1970s, not only visually but psychologically, the direction of art making and thinking. It's very powerful psychologically. It ended over 160 years of reductive painting, which is less is more, which was prevalent in that era. And also, it took out with it, ultimately, it included minimalism and conceptualism as well. You know, bye-bye. No longer interested. Now I've got just this one paragraph. And I was also looking for a third subject matter. It was in my pattern and decoration works of the early 70s that I found the first steps of release from the rigidity of formalism. Less is more, again. Up to that point in the history of art, we as artists had had only two choices of subject matter, representationalism and abstraction. That's hard to believe, but it was absolutely true. And Joyce pointed that out verbally to me. It was quite an awakening. Now, however, at the root of the did I skip a line? All right. Now, however, at the very root of the pattern and decorative concept was the discovery of the third subject matter, which for me was the mysterious ideas in the beauty of and use of ornamentation, a primal, exquisite subject matter that is always somewhere now at the core in my paintings. All of this triggered the sense of a different kind of source from which art could be made, a source that was involved with feelings of compassion and humaneness and empathy, and no longer a separate thing removed from its audience. The rigid mainstream parameters of the modernist gave way to a boundless beyond of glorious things to feel and paint, such as delicate patterns, ornamentation, emphasis on design, designs for any culture, from any culture in the world, folk art, things and subjects that were considered too feminine and therefore trivial and referred to as low art. Also of importance was the re-embracing of the word beauty. This was very important, which had disappeared from the art world until the late 19th century, which we brought back, by the way. A work of art could now be shockingly soft and tender, sweet and romantic, and even sentimental. A seemingly endless source of imagery became accessible to me. Imagery that I loved and grew up with and lived with, but had not allowed it into my painting. Firstly, because of the severe restrictions of art historical abstraction. And secondly, of gender fears, which I believe was a major reason this movement encountered such difficulty in acceptance, and still does because of it, I believe. It was considered dangerous because it went against the grain of masculine rites of passage, which are basically to abhor sweetness and sentimentality, beauty and even art itself. But here we must also realize that one of the great powers of art is that it transcends genders. It is as simple as that.
So maybe I can, I think these were the main points as far as I recall.
There are so many other we'll probably get to them anyway. But
I was
let's
just wondering.
start off with that.
So Robert sort of gave his artist statement, or a version of his artist statement, and my guess is not all of you would entirely want to be subsumed, and maybe you were talking about beauty and sentimentality and things that are obviously of great importance to your work. And I'm thinking of, for example, Valerie's work, who is very different, I think, from Robert's in its interest in versions of geometry and the irrationality that you can go to with geometry. So maybe, I don't know, maybe you want to not respond to Robert's statement, but give an idea of like a different notion of pattern than the one that Robert was describing.
Well, I was thinking while he was speaking, I wanted him to speak about what happened at that first meeting, because he was at his loft, you know. And
yes,
I remember you know, going on. You were saying, well, I'm not quite sure why we're here, but I've been seeing this stuff going on. And I knew his work very well. In fact, you even came to my studio.
Yes.
In about 1973,
right.
Nace Vandenberg drug you up there.
I was trying to remember her.
Yes, right. And which was fabulous. I mean, and he was doing work then, and this is before we even met. That was quite radical, and I think all of us saw that work, which was basically taking abstract expressionism and adding flowers with it. It was like drawing with paint, but the flowers. And it sort of was a sign that...
And stencils.
Was it stencils?
There were stencils.
They were stencils, and then you painted with the right.
Abstract. Yeah.
So we knew this very well, and this is why everybody would come to his loft, because everyone respected his work, and that was no, it was, wasn't it? I mean, really, it was why certainly I was doing it. And he mentioned Tony Robbin, and Tony Robbin and I had been on a panel about pattern, and we were just talking about pattern per se. And I see in the show, Joyce has drawings from 1974, which was exactly the time of this thing. Everybody was thinking pattern, but they didn't quite know why. And if you look in sort of retrospect, well, that's all we can do, really, because I'm not quite, I'm not quite there.
Go for it anyway.
It was, if you think about it, it was the cusp of the end of modernism, and it was we were all quite anxious and sort of angry about the sort of work that had been getting attention over and over again. And I think about 1974, there was a revival of minimalism right on top of conceptual art, and it was like, it's just too much. You know, there's like, there's got to be something different.
That's very good.
There's got to be something different. And that's what we were all looking for, but we were wondering why. And we had Amy Goldin at the time. She showed up to every panel and every meeting, which is probably not an accident.
Amy Goldin, just for our audience, was an art historian.
She used to be an artist, and she had been Bob and Kim's teacher in California, but she was from New York. She had gone to school in Chicago, and she had been a painter during the 40s.
She had studied with Hans Hofmann, who was the great abstract expressionist, and had painted for about 20 years. Stopping painting in 1964, the same year she started publishing as a critic for Art News. So there was this, it wasn't even, so it was about a 10-year gap of her being a published critic, but she had had a lot of studio experience.
She had really, since she had studied with Hans Hofmann, she knew that American abstract expressionism and how it began, and all of them, you might say, the street language for it. She was formed during this, and she was looking for a way out of, since she was such a maverick critic, she was like an artist. Well, she was an artist, right? And she was looking for everything, and she was wondering, like, why all this pattern too? Why do I like it so much? Why did she like it so much? And she was looking really for, she was asking a lot of questions like, well, what is the decorative? So what's the difference between a Persian rug and a Kenneth Nolan painting? What's the difference? Do you know? And her questioning of this was really, I think it was the thing that kept us sort of in line and really focused on a lot of the higher questions. And she brought them up, I think, all the time.
I think this would be a good moment if I can just segue, because my background was a little different, having been in California as a student at University of California, San Diego from 1967 to 71, where Amy had been a very influential professor and frankly, my intellectual mentor of all time. I mean, you know, it just keeps unfolding for me. But Kim and I started making what we call decorative work, but a little bit because you weren't supposed to. Having someone say that you were decorative was a terrible put down. So we thought, aha, there's got to be something great here if everybody is against it. Also, I must say at that time, you know, we were young, sassy art students, so anything that was perverse was very appealing. But gradually, our motto was, anything worth doing is worth doing badly.
The youth.
Yes, it was wonderful. But I think...
That was your motto.
No, Kim, so Kim, me, and Amy were working a little bit as a triad, where we were painting, we were putting dots on things, we were putting zigzags, and then she would come and say, what's the real meaning of what you're doing? Basically what Valerie said a little more articulately, but raising the bar, making it a little higher. So it wasn't just saying, oh, I want to be decorative because you're not supposed to. It was saying, well, what can we accomplish? If you say your work is decorative, what doors does that open? Similar to what Bob was saying earlier. What is possible if you fully embrace this and say, yes, I'm going to go for it? And that was brand new.
And I would just say, along with that, so one of the nice things, I think, as it all of a sudden became a movement, is that there were all these different kind of entranceways, but also everyone's background had a different way of dealing with similar things. And so it was mentioned kind of post-minimalism that was coming up. I actually happened to be part of that. I arrived in New York hitchhiking and picked up by Keith Saunier and one of Phil Glass's musicians, and they kind of introduced me to the restaurant. I've talked about this yesterday. And I worked with a lot of conceptual and minimalists at this gallery, 112 Green Street, where Phil Glass would play and everyone would lie on the floor. And I didn't know anything about contemporary art. And I just for that was my art school, cooking at this restaurant where everyone worked or ate, or a lot of people did.
The food was very good, by the way.
The food wasn't bad.
And you were cooking.
Well, thank you. But what
I was his manager.
And he came after, I'd been there for a little while, and Bob became the manager, and I met Bob there. So I was coming out of a minimalist background, making things that were based in minimalism in the beginning, but kind of going to Bob's apartment, and seeing him dripping paint all over the walls and the floor, not on canvas. And I just thought, my God, how can you do this? And then through him met Kim, and through us going along with a lot of the post-minimalists, to Holly Solomon, I kind of became educated, not kind of on a formal way, but just a gut way of looking at people that were working and showing in the same space. So, and you know, Valerie was there. I saw her work first at Holly's, and Bob's I saw first there. And for me, it was more of an intuitive reaction than an intellectual reaction. And probably because my father was a major Renaissance art historian, and that's what was at the dinner table all the time. So I reacted in a very different way to it. But I think we all picked up on this energy for whatever reason.
Yeah, it was there. It was, I mean, I picked it up in New York, and so it was interesting when I went out to the coast and felt it out there. You know, it was actually through Kim. I said,
I
we weren't
also
out there.
first became involved in this kind of discussion on the West Coast. There is a West Coast connection that a number of us had. And I lived in Los Angeles in 1970 and 71, and I had conversations. It was a very exciting moment because the beginning of the feminist movement and the feminist art movement, and I had a lot of conversations with other women, and then when I came back to New York, about art and gender, and a lot of experimentation was going on about looking at culture from the point of view of what was left out. And Miriam Schapiro invited me to the meeting at Bob's. And I came to that meeting, and I didn't know any of the rest of you. I had seen your work. And it was very exciting to me to discover that you could come to this place from a different route than the one I came to.
Yeah.
Because for me, it was totally associated with feminism. And then at this meeting, I remember two things. I was so excited I couldn't sleep that night afterward to find all of you. The first thing was this reaction against a lot of the art that was going on around us and wanting to do something that was more expressive of our personalities and that was more flamboyant and colorful and just everying.
Freed, being freed.
And for me, you know, embracing the word decorative, as soon as I did that during these discussions in 70, 71 in California, realizing that decorative was associated with the decorative arts, and the decorative arts were degraded, were on a lower level than high art. Mm-hmm. And anyway, in any case, from that meeting, I remember this reaction against what was going on around us, which was very reduced, and a lot of discussion about looking at the decorative arts and looking at the arts of many other cultures. And Tony Robbins had been, his father was a diplomat, and he'd lived in Iran and in Japan, and Bob had traveled with Amy Goldin, who was at the meeting, to Afghanistan and Iran, and I had traveled, and we were excited about things that we were seeing and that we had seen elsewhere. So that's what I remember from that meeting.
And I think in York, the question of painting already came up a few times, like implicitly. And I think you, Joyce, in the late 70s, made a conscious decision to actually leave painting and return to it after a while.
Another 20
but
years.
With the exception of Ned, who I think really has a sculptural background and is maybe was thinking about designing surfaces in a slightly different way. Obviously, the surfaces of your work are very expressive, but not so much coming from literally having a painting background. Yeah. But I think everybody else has at this panel. And I just, knowing a little bit about how your work evolved and seeing the work in the show, I think each one of you has a very different stake in that history. And
can I interject right here? Sorry. the one thing we really had in common, and this was really fascinating because we were all thinking really differently, but the one thing we had in common was the attitude. We had this attitude that we wanted to explode.
Was that your attitude, Richard?
Sure.
Did you want to explode?
A movie,
Or explore.
Or explore,
Well,
sorry.
I wanted
You said
to
explore.
do
I'm
both.
sorry. You wanted to do both.
Well, I think that,
God, it was amazing.
yes, of course, when you're younger, everything seems quite radical and brand new, just like every generation discovers sex. And,
But
but
I was older. No, I didn't. Sorry, Richard.
No,
but,
it's true.
But I was older.
Robert
because
Robert
I had already
Zakanitch.
established myself as a formalist painter. I was a colorist.
Right, yeah.
And I was written up in Time magazine, and then I thought, there's more out there. How do you stop? Why do you keep doing? You can't keep doing the same painting. There's too much energy out there, and I can get into high tech and all that stuff because it's changed the world and the way we saw it. But anyway.
Anyway,
I won't say
you
that.
start thinking you're doing something brand new and extremely radical, and of course that does come out of larger contexts, and also the idea of being against something, which is actually, even though pattern and decoration is one of the beginnings of postmodernism, that idea of sort of binary opposition is a reasonably modernist idea, and I see a much larger continuity from it. Certainly, the reaction against minimalism and reductivism was more or less a reaction against what was immediately there, or against the formalism that was espoused by Clement Greenberg. But there were a lot of people that were not very interested in that or against that. Critics were against that, but critics had a much greater importance, not only Amy Goldin and Greenberg and Harold Rosen, but a more inclusive critic like Lawrence Alloway, who was English and came to the United States. So I think what was happening was that this is part of a larger movement that both continued the discussions that certainly started off in abstract expressionism, but earlier on in the Bauhaus and the Leichenhoffman came from that particular milieu, and so there's a lot of continuation. Certainly a very strong impulse of pop art, and despite the fact that there's a lot of figurative or realistic imagery in it, it's still a way of taking and integrating abstraction and figuration in a way that was quite new. There's nothing really quite like that before, but the interest in expanded subject matters, in many ways, was just a new way of making paintings or sculptural work, and it's very allied to the larger post-minimal movement. People like Keith Saunier and even early Richard Serra, who was a post-minimalist before he was a minimalist. So there's a lot of simultaneity. Everything is all going on. And even these earlier movements, well, people were still around. I was an assistant to Roy Lichtenstein, who was also very interested in decorative motifs, among other things. So it's both something that was reactive, but also something that was a continuation of a larger tradition. And finally, the idea of what we're doing now in addition to what we were doing in the past, was part of something that isn't really as evident now, which is the continued discussion and interaction with artists. This happened all the time. There were panels all the time. People talked all the time, and part of it was because people lived in reasonable proximity to each other, either on the West Coast or in New York. So, and in a way, finally, that the kind of pluralism that was being talked about, that let's bring new things and let's broaden the discussion. In a way, it seems kind of quaint now, because we live in a world of globalism. We live in a world of no movements. There has not been a real movement since maybe the late 80s, and as it's been said, the pattern decoration was one of the last really artist-generated movements. And you can basically do anything. And this is different, it's a livelier situation, but it's also one that might even be a bit rudderless. So it's an interesting situation that we're in now.
I think, I mean, I only, my knowledge of that period is entirely theoretical, of course, and historical. But I think it's very hard to imagine how naughty a word decorative was these days. I reread a bit of what Clement Greenberg, the probably most influential modernist critic, had to say about decoration, and he called it the specter of modernist painting, like a ghost that was haunting painting and that one had to avoid at all costs. And these days it seems absurd that, and artists actually walked great lengths to avoid that that so-called Greenbergian specter of decoration. And I think today it's very hard to imagine how powerful that dichotomy, as you said, was.
But paradoxically, even though Greenberg had certain strictures about what painting or what sculpture should be, he particularly liked a certain kind of formal decorativeness that is an overall spread of color, a lack of chiaroscuro, and that he liked people like that.
He liked the flatness.
He liked
That's
flatness.
what he liked.
Yes.
Yeah, but not the decorative.
Not the decorative referentially, but the decorative formally.
Mm-hmm.
So by embracing decoration, things changed. I really want to disagree with you slightly because there was this foment, there was all this going on, but as a group, there was this sort of West Coast group, there was the New York group, and when we met, it was like an explosion. I really agree with Joyce. When I met you, and then you said, I think you should see Valerie's studio, I remember going to Valerie's studio and I said, I can't believe someone else is doing this, that I'm looking at these paintings I'm not tired of looking at. There was something new, and what was new was the fact that you could look at this work with a scanning eye. It wasn't an iconic image. By being decorative, by working with pattern, we were freeing the eye to move freely over the surface of the painting. That was something that was new. That was something that we all had hit on from very different directions, but feeling that we shared that, and we maybe didn't articulate it that way, but feeling that we shared it gave a lot of us a push. There was just a feeling that I'm not alone. I'm not just sort of fooling around anymore. There's a bunch of us, and this mood is shared.
Another thing that I think came up, which was less painterly, was the fact that Bob would paint these fabrics, and then he would use them for a fashion show. And at the end of the fashion show in the gallery, they would be pinned up as works of art on the wall, so that bingo. Well, it's not pinned up yet, but so the idea of it goes beyond painting. For me, it was kind of surprising to see Bob and Kim particularly, because they weren't stretched and they were hung, and the fact that it had been used for something else took the pretense of a painting away, and that affected me because my background had been dragged from one church to museums from age 1 right through to university. And I was always blown away on a gut level, not on an intellectual or conceptual way about walking into a cathedral, but it was not dissimilar for a kid of walking into an amusement park, because you heard the roar of the rides and the people and the smell of the popcorn and the lighting, and so you had a reaction to an environment. And churches were like that. It was cooler, darker, and so painting glass, stained glass, everything. There wasn't one object. It wasn't like, this is my blue painting, this is my red painting. It was an accumulative effect of all these different arts that gave you a gut reaction. And so that's the way I took it. But the idea of making objects that weren't an object, but was part of something, to get away from commercialism on a certain level. And I think, and you, in a sense, were making environments like that. Judy Faff came to Holly at a certain point and kind of worked out of chaos with kind of these environments. I had learned a little about them at 112 with Gordon Matta Clark cutting holes in the floor and people putting big, so that the space became part of this minimal piece of work. But I think where a number of us went was into public art, because we were making spaces, and then a corporation or the government would say, well, what would you do in this space? We don't like what the architects were doing. So art as part of an environment, built in, working with the architecture, was another way that all this ideas kind of led to.
I remember this hilarious performance that Kushner did at Holly Solomon. This is the beginning of Soho. This is, from 1970 to 1975. There were, in this 10-block area, which made all of these meetings and everything very common, very, very popular. It was so easy to see everybody. There were like 2,000, in 1974, there were 2,000 artists living in this 10-block area, and they were 80% of the population. The other 20% were dealers and people who worked in galleries. We're talking no normal people in this entire area. Bob did this performance, and I tell you, I was on the floor. It was so hilarious. Since there were so many artists, particularly doing acrylic paintings, they were throwing them away, because it was a fabric area. They would throw a lot of fabrics away. So people were throwing their paintings away all the time. You would walk by and you'd see a whole stack.
They would just put a cut in it and then roll it up.
And roll it up and throw it away. And he did a nude performance with about 30 of these. There
were about 4. There were
only about 4?
Yeah.
They must have been huge, though. They were huge.
I pulled them out of the trash, recut them.
They were like capes. And he did a dance, and he had several people. And it was in the Holly Solomon Gallery. And I was sitting on the floor, and it was just hilarious.
Afterwards,
they were
several people came up to me and were really angry because it was their paintings. I thought, well, you threw it away. Not only that, if I can just add, being acrylic on canvas made them waterproof, so I considered them rain gear, and so people were wrapped up in this, and my wife actually had a plant sprayer, so she was spraying them with water to show that they would repel water. It was a lot of fun.
Well, actually, a lot of us moved off the canvas. Not all of us, but a lot of us moved off the canvas in different ways, whether it was onto the body or into the rest of the room, or whether it was into public space. First of all, pattern keeps repeating. You don't contain it within a geometrical surface. It can go anywhere. And Cynthia Carlson, who's not in this show, was making kind of wallpaper pieces and extending it around the room. And I remember when I saw her show at a gallery on West Broadway called 100 Acres, in the basement. I walked in there, and she had extruded paint from tubes, and she had, in a kind of decorative way, and put it all over the wall. And this must have been 73 or 74, and I started to laugh, and I couldn't stop laughing. And then in the corner, she had a piece where she had extruded all this paint and just piled it up. And it freed me, in a way, seeing that. So, what would happen is, I was, like a lot of us, I was giving lectures in universities. And we had this rhetoric about breaking down the arts, between the high art and decorative arts. And I had people in the audience challenge me and say, you're just taking motifs from the decorative arts and making paintings. And that is what I was doing at that time. Many of us were doing, and many of us are still doing in one way or another. But you know, the people who were weaving and making pots, it was like they were upwardly mobile and we were downwardly mobile. And rather than feeling that what we were doing was an homage, they felt threatened. And I had them in the audience saying this, and then I started to think about it. And I felt that my own rhetoric had gotten me in trouble in a way, and because I didn't know how to do anything besides painting, and that I had to kind of get my hands dirty and muck around and learn about other media. And that's when I started experimenting with ceramics and with textiles. But it's not just me, a lot of people were doing that.
I think that that might be a good moment to bring up the question of feminism again, which has been alluded to mostly by you, Joyce, and that's I wanna split it in like two questions, and the first one is addressed to you, Joyce, and Valerie, because I want to mention this really important to me, and I think to everybody who gets his hands on it, text or compilation of quotes that you did in '78, or that was published in '78. I think working on it took much longer, called Art Hysterical Notions of Progress and Culture, which was published in a feminist magazine called Heresies, which you also edited, or in a collective, edited collectively. And it's basically a collection of quotes that engage the notion of decoration by looking at what art historians have had to say about it in the past. And the quotes you choose make very clear how biased and how charged a term decoration has been, and also how gendered it is. And I would be very interested in maybe hearing you talk about that a little bit. And that's the first part of the question. And then I want to talk about the male approach or the male.
You want to talk about it, Valerie?
Sure.
What
did I say, Joyce?
I've already.
Well, let's say it's about 1976 in the summer. Did we start working on the Heresies? We started working on the Heresies magazine. We were one of 9 editors, 9 feminist editors. There are a lot of jokes about this. It's like, how many feminists does it take to? Anyway, it was quite. and working on this magazine together, we're getting a lot of people sending in things. We've solicited a lot of articles. And so we're reading this. It's like an incredibly, and this went on for about 6 months, maybe 1 or 2 days a week. Was that it, Joyce? Something like it was some incredible length of time. It's what's called in feminism in the trenches together. It was like a very intense seminar, and I don't think the men understood what we were undergoing. It's like you're rethinking feminism, you're rethinking the decorative, you're rethinking everything, and it's just us 9 women there dealing with everybody's articles. It's like, well, Susan Sontag, she's not a feminist. No, reject hers. It's like, oh, I mean, it was quite intense. It was quite intense. And Joyce, I had been, when the first call came out, I think it was Joyce and Mimi were starting Heresies, in a way, with some other people. And the first call, to come and tell maybe what you could do, I just mentioned that I had been collecting, just in my sketchbook, sort of quotes about the decorative, because that was what my work was always getting. But of course, that was the way, go to art school and you're a woman, you're going to say, everyone says, oh, this is really nice, but it's so decorative. This is really nice, but it's so decorative. So you grow up this way, you gotta do this. So I had collected a lot of quotes, and we had Barbara Novak, who was a great art historian at the time. She said, oh, you must do something. And I was thinking, no, I'll just hand these over. I don't have to do anything. I'll just hand them over. And she said, and then Joyce said, oh, let's do it together. I have some. And so Barbara Novak told us how to do it. She said, you collect them, and then you divide them up into different categories, and then you sharpen them up, and then you fill out their real sources. And she told us how to do it. I mean, she was a great teacher at Columbia. So this is how it started. And Joyce and I, all the time that we were working on heresies, having this intense seminar, essentially among ourselves, we would go and work on her kitchen table, putting all these quotes together. This was fabulous fun, I have to tell you, doing this. This was great.
It's quite wild reading it, even today, I think.
It's in the catalog.
Yeah, we reprinted it in the catalog, and it's also available in German in the book. And it hasn't lost any of its edge, I think, to see these very misogynist quotes in that kind of density. That brings me to the second. I wanna think about the. I know that even within you, the question how feminist pattern and decoration was would probably trigger different responses, depending on who you ask. And it's certainly something that, from today's perspective, is very interesting, because I can't think of many movements, certainly not in the 70s, that I don't think it's a 50-50 if you count the heads, but each one of you has said that both the female and the male artists were on equal footing when it came to discussions, to thinking about the issues that were important to you. And I wonder how the male artists among you, like, that must have been, well, an interesting situation, to say the least. Either one of you who feels...
I was publicly attacked for, verbally, for painting on fabric, because that was supposed to be women's territory. We had given, at least 3 of us were on a panel at the College Art Association, and afterwards, women came up and said, how dare you? How dare you work on fabric, because that is something that belongs to women. And it really shook me up. And Kim and I ended up talking a lot about this, because the feminism of that early era was really, my reaction was male exclusionary. We weren't, I had total respect, total support, but it was very hard to be a man without it feeling like I was jumping in on something that had been hard won, and I respect that so much, the work you were talking about. So the dialogue shifted, at least for Kim and me, in terms of what's happening out in the world, what we at that time called third world. Why are these textiles, these weavings we look at, viewed as something that is inexpensive and you put on the floor, whereas the painting goes on the wall? So we had to find a different way to react to what you folks were bringing to the table, but was true to us as men. I think Kim would say the same thing if he were here. That has changed dramatically for me over the years. When I think it was about 6 or 8 years ago, there was an exhibition at the Jewish Museum in New York called Jewish Feminists, and I was really thrilled to be invited to be in it, because by that time I started thinking of myself as a male feminist. But then they said, will you give a talk? And I realized that I didn't know my stuff. And so I started reading in terms of third wave, fourth wave, feminist dialogue, not in great depth, but the way it is now presented, or what turned it around for me, I'm actually very consciously talking to both of you who were there at the very beginning, is that feminism can be defined as anything which calls into question male dominance, male superiority, male privilege. And I said, yes, that's what I've always been doing. Even though I am a man, I have always been repelled by that. And with my work, I wanted it to have a brashness, but a softness. I wanted the fabric to be fragile, to be vulnerable. The performances are a whole nother story because they call into issues of sexuality, issues of sexual presentation publicly, issues of materiality and ephemerality, all of which I think are associated with some of the issues that you dealt with in the Heresies article. But as soon as I read that, it was great for me to feel like I belonged rather than looking in through a window.
Well, I think that we were all, of course, personally sympathetic to it and didn't feel that these old hierarchies really meant anything. And one of the things that was so interesting to me, and I think a lot of us, about the decorative was its anonymous sourcing, and that the idea that the whole range of the decorative, whether it be architectural ornamentation, game boards, any sort of thing that you see in the world, textiles and the like, very often didn't have a name. And one of the things that I think we sensed directly or indirectly was the question of originality. That is the originator of the authority, and the authority had been traditionally male, and we were much more interested in things that didn't come with kind of pre-approved authority. And I think that was the larger issue that got a lot of us going.
The only thing a different way, I coming to New York super naive and being connected to this gallery, which was an artist-run space, not a financial space, 112 Green Street. I came in contact with maybe 4 women artists who were part of that collective, I was kind of just blown away how strong they were. And it was kind of my pre-entrance into really the issues of, at the Met, when Gelthaler did his show and didn't include women, and I hadn't even learned that yet. But I was with these women, Tina Gerard, who did work that was very feminine, and using her growing up in her house and her cooking and everything. Susie Harris, these women were like as strong and demanding in this group. My time, I'm showing this. So I kind of came out of that, and then became aware of all the problems, and friends who became part of the Guerrilla Girls and things like that. But it was kind of coming from an all-male school and an all-male college, coming to New York and kind of being in this male-female space, but both kind of really equal and powerful, that I only then began to learn that there was something else. And actually, through Holly's, the way I would add about feminism is that I think that, for me it was a big effect, of kind of coming in contact with and I was becoming aware, but coming in contact with Tommy Lanigan Schmidt, who had been a transvestite and who was making this very kitsch, reverent pieces, and I was making, but how could you do that? And it was just kind of an opening of doors, seeing Bob's fashion shows, seeing Kim sewing and doing things that enables me all of a sudden to not be so uptight and macho and be able to use and do things that I hadn't even thought about that you could do that. And so it was like opening a floodgate. But I think that the feminine nature, whether it's political or whether it's the emotional, open, whatever, I think underlines it all, depending where you start.
I'd like to say a few words about Miriam Schapiro, who was an original member of the group and very active member of the group, she was 20 years older than me. And in the beginning, she was something of a mentor to me, and we became colleagues. She found feminism at middle age, and most of us found feminism as young, coming into the world. So she was like, we have this expression, born again. And so she was, in a way, a fiercer feminist than the younger women, because she turned her whole life around, her professional life and every other aspect of her life. But she would talk about things and in terms of her work and in terms of women's work that would make me cringe. Like sentimentality, for instance. I mean, I could deal with decoration, I could embrace decoration, but sentimentality, I mean, I wasn't going there. And domesticity. And, you know, you have the house painting there, and they were houses, and they were hearts, and they were fans, and they were these symbols, but she took them to a very public scale. So she wanted to take the domestic and the sentimental to a very public scale, and she had been an exhibiting artist for 20 years before, abstract artist. And I think that's really something that was part of what was going on, and there were other people like that too.
So, Joyce, or Valerie, what would Mimi say to answer Manuela's question about the role of feminism in pattern and decoration?
Is there any way of answering that?
Well, it's a guess. It's a guess.
You know, I think each of us is speaking from such a different experience, and I think what's emerging is that we had these different routes that we took, and we ended up somehow, I don't want to say in the same place, but we ended up in a community that shared ideas and shared, and maybe that's why it was so exciting that we weren't all coming from the same place.
But very supportive is kind of what you're saying.
Very supportive. And I just want to reinforce what you said, that it was totally, there weren't any hierarchies. It was totally the same for the men and the women. And for me, in my life, that was not the experience I'd had anywhere else. And it was just incredible to be with these men who didn't put me down.
I think I want to thank you for that. I want to try to open our conversation to the audience and see if there are any questions. There's certainly plenty of things that one could want to hear about in greater detail. So,
at which time started the
could you wait for the microphone, please?
I would like to know at which time the first exhibition, group exhibition about pattern and decoration art took place. I guess in New York because of the gallery. Yeah. In which year?
September. It was September 1976.
Where?
And it was in New York. It was right in the center of Soho. And it was a gallery that had pretty much just started, as they all had just started.
Is that the Alessandro Gallery?
That's the Alessandro Gallery. And Jane Kaufman, who had been on, I mean, there were a lot of people involved and around this. And Jane Kaufman, a terrific artist, she was on a panel with Joyce. Did you arrange that, or was that Amy Goldin?
The panel or the show?
Well, it was she was on the panel, and then that's how she became much more involved. And then she simply went to her dealer and said, "I'd like to put together a show." Yeah. And so it was quite that simple. And she didn't tell anybody. She didn't tell me. She just asked if I wanted to be in it. So, and this is how it sort of started. Yeah,
that was the first show.
And that show was called 10 Approaches to the Decorative.
Right.
Was a catalog something, a booklet?
No, I don't
No,
think
there
it
was a Xerox printout. Each of us wrote a statement, and they were stapled together. And Xeroxed and handed
stapled
out.
Together. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But that was a very interesting time, though, because it really was in the community now, in the whole art community. Because I know, 6 months later, I had my first show with Holly Solomon of the new work that I was doing, which was about pattern and decoration. And Jane just took it on first, and it was a great show, by the way. We have questions.
Many.
I'm just wondering, is anything like that happening at the same time in Europe? I'm just thinking of, for example, of Memphis.
Memphis.
But it's a completely different background.
No, that's interesting.
But
I was aware of Memphis. I think a lot of us were. And at a certain point, there were some meetings between us and some of the postmodernist architects in New York. There was certain things were in the air. And in terms of sources, in terms of references.
Well, that was around 1979 or 80, I think. It's interesting how it goes from the early days of 74, 75. It's like your drawings, Joyce, of, they're dealing with pattern, and you're trying to figure out, as we all were, and you're drawing them out like this. So it's like, well, this is pattern. And then the more we talk about pattern, decoration comes up, because they're obviously pretty decorative. And if we're going to push it, there's only one way it can go. And so we had to deal with what is decorative.
I have another answer to your question. There was a group in France called Support Surface. I don't know at what point we became aware of it. I don't know at what point it was shown in the United States, but it was written about in art magazines. It was different from us, but there's some parallels.
And the huge artist was Zygmunt Polka, which Linda asked me about. I didn't know about his work when we were first meeting, and I know that it would have been very hard to see, and I didn't see them until the early '80s, and at which point I said, "Oh my goodness, this is."
Holly did a show of him, right? Was that where you first saw it?
Yes.
Yeah.
It was a show of his work from the '60s, shown in the early '80s. So these huge pieces on fabric mounted on paper, and they were so great. They had a different agenda.
Yeah.
They had a ferocity, and the use of pattern was, I think, very almost perverse, of saying I want to use this pattern to undermine the image on top of it.
Break it up.
Rather than what I think we were doing, which was a kind of positive
And
thrust.
there was a group called Crisscross in Colorado that was a pattern painting group, and I think they actually predated us.
Yeah, and there were a lot of them.
Yes, and they had a little publication they put out a couple of times, maybe twice a year, and at some point we became aware of each other. They were much more straight pattern without the decoration.
There was a...
Were you aware when you were working on the work of Gustav Klimt, because he's often defamed here as being decorative, and how do you respond to that now in relation to his work? You're in the city where you can see a lot of them.
We saw a lot in the last 2 days.
We saw a lot this week.
I'm very tired of walking around this.
Well,
but they were beautiful. It was really worthwhile. They were wonderful to see.
One of the
Now,
things
to answer your question
that I reacted to was I was trying to add color and imagery to architecture, and particularly if you were doing public work or it's outside, you couldn't do fresco, so mosaic came up. And I had, as a kid, always loved the Byzantine gold ceilings with raw, kind of Romanesque columns. So when I saw Klimt, it just kind of connected this kind of the decorative gold with imagery and things like that, which also connected me in a sense being in a Japanese wooden temple that would be very pure raw wood, and you walk in and there would be a gold Buddha. So the idea of decorative with a painted surface or a stone surface or a wood surface. But Klimt was pretty, you know, it popped my eye out. I had never been aware of it until, or thought about such a thing until I saw it.
Well, we studied Klimt in art history. I mean, we certainly knew about it, and I think probably all of us loved it. But
what would you see as the relationship between Klimt's art and your work?
specifically.
No, in general as a group.
I like paint, and I like to work thick. I like it to drip, and etc. And all of that energy. And Klimt, to me, was a beautiful designer, and using gold beautifully, and everything was perfectly placed. So I thought he was great at graphics, high style design. But that's as far as I went with him. But I love the work. It's just very different. An end result for me would be a complete one.
But I think what Klimt did is it sort of made us look at other earlier art in a different way. That is, we started looking less at the subject and more about the surround, more about the frame. There's much talk about looking at frames and how they were never seen in reproductions and the general context, and how often the decorative was in the background and in the peripheral areas, and so much of what we were engaged in is taking things that were ostensibly peripheral and bringing them to the foreground.
But it also connected, for me, being in Italy and the gold backgrounds behind the saints. So it really, there was this kind of, it just seemed a really interesting way. And actually there was a slide here of the arches with paintings of swans. The backgrounds were all gold leaf. We had painted the room, Brad Davis and I worked together, and we did gold filigree all around the top decorative line around the room. So it kind of, for me, I could see it throughout history and around the world, and why not use it?
I feel, when you asked specifically about a connection, I feel a tremendous emotive power from Klimt's use of pattern, where it is not, to me, it's not fill. It's not just filling in the space. It's actually moving out of the space and almost viscerally affecting me. And the other day, several of us were in the Mac Museum, where there's the maquette of the unbelievable Palais Stokely mosaic. I got overwhelmed just looking at the line and how sensitive he was to the fact that you could combine pattern and non-patterned areas, but the pattern had a power to reach out of the surface and literally enter your consciousness in a way that was independent of the narrative.
It also had a certain sensuality to it. And I know that I was particularly interested in Matisse and Bonnard, and it sort of has an interesting aroma to it. And I think that we want to sort of try to look at art in its fullest way, and yet still, despite the movement out into 3 dimensions and the like, to still be in some way bounded by the certain conventions of art and to disrupt them and make them stronger. So just like I'll do anything you want is not quite as interesting as do anything you want within certain limits.
I can just add something anecdotal to Klimt in relation to pattern and decoration. Maybe some of you have seen the signature piece, or the piece that we used for all the printed matter, posters and so forth. It shows a work by Miriam Schapiro, Dorma, the house-shaped. And I had several, and frankly, I had never thought about Klimt. I mean, it's kind of silly being here and not thinking about Klimt when working on pattern and decoration, but I haven't. And when we worked on the poster and we had the first designs and you start showing them around to people, seeing whether they like it or not, a few people were thinking of Klimt's The Kiss and were kind of seeing that kind of organic pattern, geometry thing going on that Klimt does so well in that, in the surface of Miriam Schapiro's work. And at first I thought, what? But I started to be able to see what people mean when they say that. So that would be an interesting side, maybe in relation to someone's work who can't be here tonight. I don't know what she would have said, but
she loved Klimt.
She loved Klimt. Good, good. And we're not completely off. That's good.
It's unanimous.
It's sensational work. Okay.
I think, yeah, the microphone.
Yeah, you have spoken about houses, architecture, and decoration. So I'm living near Hundertwasser house. What do you say about the houses of Hundertwasser?
Of what?
Do you know the Austrian artist Friedensreich Hundertwasser?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And there's buildings in Vienna that he designed.
Oh, an architect, I'm sorry.
Which I don't think you've seen on this trip, but maybe you know, maybe some of you know the work a little bit. So that's what the question is, because he also obviously has some kind of interest in decoration.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
I don't know.
Hundertwasser. I know the work a little bit. I don't know whether we were. I don't think we were thinking about it then.
One point. It's interesting because in the decoration there are many flowers, leaves, and so on. And he said there is the right to have a tree in the house. Really, it's true.
Definitely have a lot of trees in the house right now. If you walk through the exhibition, I see there's more behind, but I'm.
You talked a lot about the different media you worked with, so going from painting into textiles, also through to performance. And I was wondering whether you had ever what your connection was, if you had any, to film. And I'm specifically thinking, since there were very strong sort of avant-garde film traditions connecting to the art in New York, as well as on the West Coast. I'm thinking about Jack Smyth. This is going back to the 60s, or Kenneth Anger, who obviously also had a very strong kind of decorative element to their work. So I was wondering whether there was any interest or any connection ever to film or avant-garde cinema.
Are you saying film?
Yeah, avant-garde film.
Slow it down a little, because...
Sorry.
That's all right.
Whether there was ever any interest around sort of avant-garde film practices, which also did have, interest at times in sort of decorative...
Well, I think all the arts are connected. We're all one, and I'm trying to think of the film was it the English film, which everyone called the painter's film. Help, don't you? It's a man's name, and it was like a painting that was moving, and It really was. It was a beautifully painted film. But that doesn't answer your question.
No, I mean, I think my question was more whether, because throughout the 1960s there was a lot of connection. There was a lot of connection between, you know, in the sort of with the avant-garde film scene in New York, and whether there was ever any sort of touching points with your work. That was sort of my...
I don't remember anything like that.
Well, I can only speak personally about one thing. Probably the most formative thing that happened to me as a young artist is I've seen it many, many, many times, a film by a California filmmaker named Bruce Bailey called All My Life. Has anybody seen that film? No. Well, it's a film. It's about 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes long, and it is a song sung by Ella Fitzgerald called All My Life, and along with it, the camera makes a tracking shot, a pan from right to left along a fence that is a slatted wooden fence that's covered, kind of broken, that's covered with roses. Yeah, and when it gets to the end of the song, gets to the end of the fence, and then it pans up. I looked at it first, and I saw it many times. It was in 1967, and I said, "What's that? What does this mean? Doesn't mean anything." And it suddenly, after about the 4th time I saw it, I said, I understand it. This is all you need. And so, a very important part of that was a sense of limitations of a flat plane, but a flat and ornamented plane with strongly decorative elements. I would urge you to see it. You can get it on YouTube. Just look up All My Life, Bruce Bailey.
You know, I was thinking about the question. I don't think any of us made films, but film was a big discussion, and we went to films. Everybody we were all very interested in film in the 60s and 70s, and there was so much going on. And also films from Europe and other parts of the world. And I know that much of my work and a lot of my ideas then and now and always have sources and images and ideas that are associated with film.
Just one addendum, and that's more a social connection probably than a work, a question of influence. Thomas Lanigan Schmidt was friends with Jack Smith. And I think it was probably more the performance part that connected them. I don't really see how film has influenced Thomas Lanigan Schmidt's work very much, but there was they were in the same circles, so to speak.
I was watching film quite a lot, like Stan Brakhage and things like that, what he was doing to the surface and things like that. But also I was in early Richard Foreman plays, which were, I don't know if you know his work, but I learned a lot because it was all about placement and sounds and buzzers, and so the idea of environment, I learned a lot just by standing for a 3-hour play, very little dialogue, but just being and moving and things like that. So how it actually translates, it certainly translated into the idea of environment for me, or and installation, but I don't know of any film really in this.
But it all sounds like deconstruction. I mean, the 20th century to me is like a grand laboratory for the deconstruction of all the arts. Everything was, which we call formalism, like dance, modern dance. You know, you can have 10 dancers. You have 10 people, and 10 people walk across the stage individually. You have 10 dancers. just from your natural body movements. That's stripping down dance to the basics of formalism. And I mean, it applied in all of the arts, the writing, literature, I should say, and music. I mean, I'm an opera fan, and I'm still waiting for the contemporary opera composer to write a real aria again, because that's what we want to hear. Instead, we're getting straight lines, and they go, "Oh, did you see the dance?" And that's it. You know, it's like, well, stop and then sing something. I really want to hear it. You know, that's why no one's going to the opera, I think, because. Anyway, that's me, and stripping down of music. But I love all the arts. They're all connected, and that's why I thought that this whole movement just put a kick into art again, instead of all this stripping down that we have to sit through these boring performances of things. It's like, make them alive again. And that's what I think this whole movement is about. And still about. I mean, it's still here, you know. It's
thriving.
Yeah, and I thank you for having this show. By the way, this is the most beautiful P&D show I've ever seen. I mean, and we haven't
Thanks
shown
to all of
together
you.
at this. Oh, it's such a great show. I'm patting myself and everyone else on the back on this show.
Exactly.
I have two questions. Who gave the whole movement the title Patterning Decoration? First. The second is, normally, if you read in a critic, this is a very decorative art. It means it has a negative
Of
aspect.
course.
It is superficial.
Yeah.
It's just decorative, and I mean, you know, the sentences of Matisse. I always wanted to be a good decorative master, and they always were a little bit taught Matisse, a little bit, I say. Oh, just decorative.
Mm-hmm.
Were you aware of this, and yet you did the decision for that title of the movement?
Well, that was Bob. I mean, I would have called it pattern and ornamentation, because I don't do decoration well. That's the problem, and it's hard to do. And I keep thinking, well, I don't want to paint it. It's something you do. It's always an action. So I felt I couldn't isolate it long enough to paint it. You know.
Well, there was a famous book by Robert Venturi, the architect.
He loved pattern and decoration.
Yes, The Duck and the Decorated Shed. And that was, and in a way that encapsulated the dilemma. So the duck actually came from a building out on eastern Long Island. It used to have a lot of ducks in there, and the building was in the shape of a duck. And so that's the essence essentially of modernist formalist architecture, which is the form follows function, and it's consistent and coherent with it. Whereas the decorated shed took a kind of basic repurposable thing and added a decoration to it. So that was critically in the air around the time. It was around the same time.
And yet,
But the name, Bob, tell her.
There was a dinner at Lu Chow's restaurant on 14th Street.
There's a name I haven't heard.
It's gone.
I know.
A German restaurant. And Holly, and I really want to credit Horace Solomon, who was a very strong supporter of this as well, Holly's husband, and Amy Goldin and me. And gradually, I think the gallery had maybe not yet opened, but Holly had been attracted to the work of us one at a time. You know, first Brad Davis, and then it expanded, and suddenly she had this stable of people doing work that didn't look like anything else. And here's this dinner with maybe several glasses of wine, and I said, she was very dramatic, but what could I call it? So I said, well, we're making decoration. I can't call it decoration. It has to be more than that. How about, I'm really channeling this a million years ago. What if I call it patternings? And Amy said, well, that's like using droppings instead of saying shit. So it went back and forth, and finally by the end of the evening, pattern and decoration. Decoration and pattern. No, pattern and decoration. And she added.
In which year?
Oof, I don't know. Long time ago.
That was 1976, that first show that Amy Goldin did the catalog for.
No, but this was before that. This was Holly. I think it was before the gallery. No, 73, 74.
The gallery, I think, opened in 75.
Yeah.
Okay, so then it was somewhere in 74, but she wanted a label. And that's my experience.
She was very much against the decorative, and she and Amy fought about this. I remember talking with Amy about it, and I was saying, you know, if everybody's saying it's decorative, why don't we just say, because I had talked to Joyce about it too, it's like, let's just say it's decorative. Let's see what they say. Let's just do it, because it's instead of sitting there waiting for, oh, it's so nice, but it's decorative. Just go ahead and say it. And I remember talking to Amy about this, and she said, you know, you can get in a lot of trouble about this kind of thing, but if you do it the right way, maybe you can get away with it. I don't know. It's like
I would just also, and I think that's totally true, but I kind of want to give Holly some more credit in the sense that one brought a number of us together that enabled this to happen, but also if you went to her apartment, the way she hung the art was salon style. Everything was covered, and the couches would be painted by Kim, and there'd be an enormous fabric piece of Bob's over it and painted things, and I would have concrete altarpieces at the end of hallways, and under tables would be pieces. Charlie Simmons. But the place, it was an environment. It wasn't an apartment where there was this, you know, a nice painting over the, well, it was a nice painting. There was a small painting here and a drawing here. It was just salon up to the ceiling, covered, and that changed my idea of how to hang a show.
It was beyond Kunst.
That was a work piece.
She wanted her apartment to be an extension of her new view of the world. And it was full. It was richly full of everything.
And I want to say something back. What you two were talking about, or you referred to Bob's work as it goes beyond painting. Did you say?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No. Or it goes on. You said it goes beyond.
Well,
art.
No,
I just wanted to add that. I think.
It wasn't a single object over a couch.
No.
It wrapped around the wall.
But his work in general, I think, is an enormous extension of painting. And when that hit me, I thought, wow, these are quite a contribution. Because you destroyed the frame, acceptable frame. Mm-hmm. And yet they're still holding up his paintings. I didn't think that was possible.
Hopefully.
Believe me, it is. Anyway.
I see more questions, one here and one here. I don't know who was first.
Thank you. I would like to know whether you met Peter Ludwig personally.
Yes.
I never did, unfortunately.
Everybody who did, hands up.
How come I missed this?
And what was your remembrance of him?
I'm sorry?
He came to my studio, and he bought that floor piece.
From the studio?
What?
From your studio?
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, through my gallery.
The funny thing is that Holly would tell me that Mr. Ludwig will be here. Dr. Ludwig, don't come. He doesn't want to meet the artist. He doesn't want to be influenced by his personality. So I happened to run into him at the gallery at one time, but I was always led to believe he didn't want to meet. I don't know.
That's
and
what she was
also,
saying.
I
Yeah.
met him again.
That's what she
Maybe
said.
that's because she wanted to control it.
No, she wanted to control it completely because he would come to the opening and he would stand in the middle of the floor and these other dealers would come to him like crazy and she would say, now don't, you know, I'm going to introduce you, but you move away very quickly because he does not want to know the artist. He was very dignified. He was very, very dignified in this opening of Holly
He wore a
Solomon's.
suit and tie.
Oh, definitely.
And I met him again when I installed the floor piece the first time in Aachen in 1980, and I was there for a week doing the installation. That was the old building, the old museum, and on the last day, he brought me to take home to New York about a dozen boxes of chocolates in shopping bags, and he had these different lines from the high end to the, you know, bottom end. He had all these, and so it was a mixture of all these boxes of chocolate. And I remember when I got home, I had a young child. He was like, "Wow."
Mom is so cool.
What a nice memory. What a nice memory.
So hello. I have a question. You spoke about pattern and decoration, and you're telling us the history, how everything started. But what I found interesting also is that this never ended. I mean, it's still contemporary. So in a kind of way, it's beautiful to see how this thing went through the decades. And mostly, I see that a lot of your artwork has also finished to combine and work together with architecture. So you see your jobs in public artwork in big spaces. So the fact that in a kind of way you went out of the frame maybe helped to work with other medium and even so I think it's a plus, not a limit. You know, the fact of being a decoration helped a lot your work to enter inside big spaces, public spaces and all that. So I just kind of like to hear your opinion about this and how all this not only survived through the decades, but grew up. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Well, I agree with you about architecture. I think it affected architecture. I personally got a beautiful letter from Robert Venturi, who asked to collaborate with him, and I was thrilled to death. Yeah, I really loved his work. And also, is it Philip Johnson who, quite soon after, when did he put that Chippendale top on the building?
It wasn't us.
It wasn't us.
I don't want
Blame
credit for that.
I don't want any, yeah, I don't want to touch that one.
But it was...
I
love Michael Graves. I don't think it has anything to do with us. I think it was just...
Could I I'm sorry, were you finished?
No, you say something and then I'll say something. Go ahead.
I have been thinking about the past and the in between Linda.
Linda.
Pardon.
We were talking about Richard.
Thank you. I've been thinking about this show. I've been thinking about what Manuela introduced to this show and how sensitively she moved into the time period, which is very specific. But I also thought about gratitude and the fact, and I'm going to address this to you folks and people who aren't here. I was so young and so lucky to drop in not only to this circle of people, but this idea, this seed. If you say that the decorative is just like planting a seed, for the rest of my professional life, it has just grown and changed, and I've moved away from it and come back. But whenever I get lost, I really go back and I think, what is really decorative? What really propelled me as a 24-year-old or 25-year-old to do that work? And it still works. It's still alive. It's still vital. And other sources come in, other cultures come in, but that basic idea of if I say I'm making decoration and I'm quoting these great artworks from other parts of the world and my own culture, it has given me a power over this entire time that I really want to just come back to the word gratitude, because it was lucky. it was almost lucky that we all dropped into this little petri dish, and then it just expanded from there. So thank you for asking that.
Thank you. That's a beautiful thing.
I just want to mention the person that asked the question is Fabrizio Travisanuto, who's a mosaicist, and he and his family have worked with several of us over the years. And it's many people among us work in almost a kind of applied, decorative, ornamental, architectural way in public buildings on a pretty large scale. That's not the subject of the show. The show ends in 1980. Mid-80s. Yeah, but you can Google us and see what we've done since.
Yes.
Or maybe there will be another show someday which will show our whole careers. And I feel also that this was a subject that I fell into as a young person that has sustained me all these years, the same way that you do.
I would just kind of follow up on a number of our connection with the Travisanuto family, but doing mosaic. But as a kid, living in Rome, my parents would be sitting in the Piazza Navona having a drink, and I'd be having an ice cream, and there was Bernini. And art was part of life. It wasn't on the wall for sale. So that was kind of my coming to it. But early on in the 70s, 75, 76, there was a woman who became an art consultant, but who was married to a filmmaker who was doing films on New York, the New York 5 architects. And she started having these evenings where she wanted to show artists, certain artists' work who were doing things that she thought architects would be interested in. And so it was, I don't know if anything really came out of it, but it really was, it made everyone begin to think a bit. And I think traditionally American spaces, when they built anything, a building or out in the suburbs, a shopping community, they didn't think of space. How cheap and how big the space can be, and all the parking was right in the middle, and it was ugly. And all of a sudden in the 70s, they began to think, you know, we have to think about public space. And they started bringing in artists before the architect was finished. So there was again, lucky. We were lucky to kind of do it, but there was also an opening where all of a sudden they pulled a lot of us into that world.
Robert, did you collaborate with Robert Venturi?
No, we never did. No,
You
we never
didn't,
did,
yeah.
no. He was going away to Japan when he wrote the letter. And when he got back, it didn't happen.
But a lot. Did you do with Mitchell Jurgala? Didn't you do something in Philadelphia with them?
Yeah, I worked with Mitchell Jurgala from about 1974 during all this time to the early 80s. And I did a ceiling with Mitchell Jurgala. The first thing I did with them actually was they pulled me into the office and they said, because Jurgala said, you know, you really need to come to work for me for the summer because you've got to go to Italy. And I'm going to, you're going to use the money to go to Italy. You've really got to go. And I put together with Jurgala it was an exhibition with Robert Venturi at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. And they had me there because they said they weren't very good with, you know, all they did in those days, they put the plans under glass. And that's how they showed things. And we did a really great exhibition together with Venturi, who was extremely good with graphic design. So they were a little worried about looking bad with Venturi. So I'm very aware of Venturi and the dialogue and the both and
Scott Brown.
Everything for,
excuse me.
Yes, also.
Are there any further? I see one more question, kind of in the middle.
Right in the middle.
Right in the middle.
So thank you for this talk. It's really wonderful. It's a pleasure to listen to you and to all those stories. And also, let's say, to get the notion of the luck you were talking about. And I don't know if I add a bitter drop into the luck thing now, but I'm just really interested when you talk about the travels, the journeys, the different cultures you were collecting. So what about the kind of actual debates around cultural appropriation? Have you ever encountered, let's say, a kind of critique towards, it may be even a boring question, but I'm really interested whether there would be connections, also maybe whether you have contacts to artists or sources. You were talking about Iran, for example. Have there ever been any connections established to those countries or places you were traveling? Or was it just, let's say, a collection and bringing it into your art, or how could I imagine that?
I think that's a very important question. For me, I was doing this in a very direct way, appropriating from other cultures, and it was an homage. And in the 70s, I was accused as being a cultural imperialist, which I was not prepared for. I was very naive. That discussion didn't exist the way it does today. And I really did not have a good answer for it. It made me think, it's something I've been thinking about ever since. And I'm glad the question came up. Working on the heresies issue, about half the issue that we worked on women's traditional arts, were articles written by anthropologists about women's traditional arts in other cultures. There was a member of our collective who was an anthropologist named Elizabeth Weatherford, and she went to her network. And what we found was that these things that we loved, like the lace and the carpets that were traditionally made by women, in fact, in some cultures were a form of oppression, so that these little girls went blind making the lace or weaving the carpets, and they used the little girls because they had the dexterity in their hands, and their eyes were better than older people. And so we ended up calling the issue not just women's traditional arts, but the politics of aesthetics. And the other thing is that these objects that we now hang in museums and revere, that we consider so beautiful, like Persian carpets, in some cultures, these objects of daily life that in many cases are made by women are not seen as art. And in many of those cultures, we found that the ritual objects which were considered art, which were maybe carved sculptures, were made by men, and in some cultures, women weren't even allowed to see them. So this all became a much more complex subject than our initial just love of everything made by humans everywhere, and maybe I've talked too long. Maybe someone else should talk about this too.
I think that's a fantastic question. And like Joyce, at the beginning, I just jumped in with both feet. I want to also add that in that early time period, I was working professionally as an Oriental carpet restorer. That's how I was making my money. So I viewed that as a safety shield. I'm actually entering the warp and the weft of these things. But as time went on, it's a question that has to be readdressed periodically. And for me, the answer is respect. Am I taking something from another culture just because it's convenient or picturesque or... No, that's not, that is the answer. I'm giving the negative reasons. So am I taking, or am I saying, please, look at the masters of this? And Kim MacConnel would always say, we're nowhere near as good as the sources we're looking at. Of course we want beauty. We want to introduce something that is different, something that's fresh. But you can do it in a way that's give it to me, or you can do it in a way that has an open heart, where you're saying, I'm bringing the best of me to the table, And the other thing at the table is a dinner guest who is way beyond where I can be, like that Klimt maquette the other day, way beyond. And then if there's a dialogue between me and the source, I can say to myself, I didn't just grab it. I was listening. And I think, for me personally, that's the answer. Someone else could look at it and say, no, wait a minute, that's not the case. And I don't know what to say to them, because I've thought about it, and that's what that's the way I would answer your question.
And the other thing that's different today is the internet. So everybody in the world can see everything. And people are making art all over the world from taking from one another. And there's similar sources that someone is referring to in Japan or Australia or Brazil. And there's this, if you're on the internet, you just see this rich kind of melange of cultural sources.
You know, it was a different world in the early 70s, 75. This other work by everyone else in the world was not available in New York City. You could not see it. You didn't even have a European artist. You had a very poor city, for one thing, New York City at the time. And the work wasn't available. And we were making things to, in a way, bring to show to make it different, to put it out there. It was an embrace, and it was kind of a reformulation and bringing the taste to it. And you know, if we had lived in Vienna, this city is so gorgeous. We may never have done anything. You know, there would have been no reason. If you live in a city like this, if you live in a city like this, this is incredible. Every single time you walk down the street, you're seeing this gorgeous sort of repetition and order and beauty. It's like we probably wouldn't have existed. We couldn't have done it in Vienna. It wouldn't have worked.
Well, we would have done it somewhere else.
Well, it only worked in New York because New York was in such
so ugly.
You know, it was in difficult. It was in difficult.
No, I know. I'm clowning. I shouldn't be. I'm sorry.
There was a lot of exchange too. One of us would find a book. Actually, I've been wanting to tell you. You gave me a book of Persian miniatures in 1978 that I looked at and read. And last year, I took it off the shelf and read it. It's one of those Skira books with a picture and then 2 pages. And I read the entire book and I said, Valerie, that was such a beautiful gift because that information wasn't available. And it was really a heartfelt gift that has lasted all these years. And we were all doing that. Hey, have you seen this? Did you see the quilt, for me, the quilt show at the Whitney Museum, which was, what, 74? Was enormously important, but the information wasn't there.
The books weren't there. Nothing was there. I mean, we have such a different world. We don't understand it today.
But it was also exciting because we were like voyagers.
And we went to museums together when there was an exhibition of decorative arts and discussed it.
I think
it's over.
All in favor of adjourning this meeting.
I would like to thank all of you for your time and thoughts and getting into those questions, some of which weren't easy. And thank you for coming and for staying as long as you did. And I hope that the show, which is up for quite a few months until September, will make a difference.
Thank you for the show.